Zach and I have been married for 13 years. And several years ago, we started talking about creating our marriage bucket list. Things we wanted to do or see together. The first thing we added to that list is that we would like to visit as many of our nation's 63 national parks as possible. How does this work? There you go. Individually, we have each visited a couple that the other hasn't, but our rule is that we can't count them unless we see them together. So far, we have visited 6 together. One of those we visited this summer, the Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio. One I had seen before, but Zach had not. No other places quite capture my imagination than our national parks. They make me stand in awe and wonder at the magnitude of our world and my very, very small place in it. One that we have not yet visited separately or together is, how does this thing work? Yeah. One that we have not yet visited separately or together is Yellowstone National Park. And this particular park is located in 3 different northwestern states. It's huge. It is part of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And this park has more hot springs and geysers than anywhere else in the world. The most famous being Old Faithful. Has anybody seen this, by the way? Oh, I'm so jealous. This geyser shoots hot water and steam into the air over 100 feet, and it erupts every 33 to 120 minutes. That's a lot. It recently erupted very powerfully and was quite destructive. I've only seen this majestic thing in pictures, Lucky Johnson's, and I can only imagine how incredible it must be in person. Pretty great? Pretty cool, yeah. Yellowstone has this very fascinating story about wolf restoration, an act that completely changed the entire ecosystem of the park. Yellowstone was established in 1872, and wolves were alive and well in that area, natural predators in the park. But by the 1920s and the 30s, humans had eradicated the wolf population in the park, trying to tame the wilderness for their own safety and the safety of their livestock. However, doing so created a drastic upheaval in the entire ecosystem, throwing off the natural food chain of the wild and causing imbalance with steep repercussions. This process of adding or removing top predators from the food pyramid, known as trophic cascade, which is one of Zach's favorite words, have a trickle-down effect. And in Yellowstone National Park, the removal of wolves led to an overpopulation of elk, a huge decline in beavers, and because wolves ate elk and were no longer doing that, there was an overpopulation of elk who ate the same vegetation as the beavers and out-ate the beavers, leaving them with nothing to eat. So the beavers spread out, and they traveled to where they could find food, as anyone would do. And as they left, there were also significant impacts on the water system and the life there within. And there were tons of animals who had depended on the elk carcasses for food. But because they weren't dying and they weren't being hunted, these other animals were getting less food as well, and they had to seek it elsewhere. The ripple effects of removing the predator from the entire ecosystem were significant, and biologists started to take notice. Wolves were put on the endangered species list in 1974 to protect them going forward. So in response, a team of scientists created a plan to reintroduce wolves back to the area. They went to Canada and they went to northern Montana, and in 1995 and 96, they brought 31 wolves back to the park. There was a whole process for it. It's fascinating if you want to learn about it. And through these 31 wolves, balance was quickly restored in the park, including the animal population, i.e. the elk, the beavers, and those other animals who had lost their primary food source, as well as the plants and the waters and the land. This experiment of humans taking action to restore and heal that which humans had damaged was a success. Last week, Zach talked about what people are for. We often talk about what humans do to be destructive, right? But this idea of interrupting damage done and being proactive about creating a healthier path forward, doing what we can to bring healing and restoration of harmony, is one of those very gifts that we can actually offer. We have been working with the idea of creation spirituality for the last 5 weeks. A spirituality our friends at Worship Design Studio describe as a way of living within the community of earth that deepens our reverence for life, participates in the creativity of the cosmos, and develops our passion for justice and human transformation. It's amazing how connected justice for land, justice for humans, justice for all kinds of things are connected to one another. And this spirituality is one that operates out of an idea of original goodness, original blessing rather than original sin, original badness, that we were created and just turned bad. It reflects on God's act of creation and seeing it as so, so good. Each week, we have explored 5 essential ideas from creation spirituality, and today, in our final week with these series, we are exploring the essential idea of healing relationships. That if we begin with recognizing the divine goodness in all of nature, which includes people, but it's not limited to us as much as we want it to be, living into this spirituality compels us to be agents of healing. The capacity for healing springs from love. Love that is not just felt or savored, but is expressed in action. Our scripture that Deb read for us today talks a lot about love. And it can be easy to hear and read these words and gloss over them as if they were just niceties or suggestions. And it seems very like love, 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 love. God is love, love God, love. You know, like it can be really cyclical. And it is. But it grounds all of it, all love, seemingly possible and impossible love, in God's love. God's love for us, for all of God's creation, and love that recognizes goodness in all things. That is why I believe that Jesus' life was so powerful. God expressed as the source of love, embodied in a human, embodied in Jesus, and all of his life, all of his teachings, and his self-sacrificing way that literally rewrote our brokenness and restored us into right relationship with God and with one another. This isn't just some nice words about love, but a reminder that because God is love, we can live into love too. Something we are only able to do because we have experienced and witnessed this radical love ourselves. Love that was not earned, but given freely, simply because of who God is, one who does nothing outside of the bounds of love. Verse 18 in our passage reads this way: "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear expects punishment. The person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love." That's a hard one for me to read. I think there's lots of things to be scared about. But fear is the antithesis of love. The thing that when we allow it to keeps us from loving God, loving our neighbor, and even loving ourselves. It causes us to keep our distance, to put on our armor of protection, to hate and despise the other, and to even act in violence towards one another because we feel threatened. It causes us to eradicate the things that scare us, such as wolves, rather than seeing a world where everything belongs and we are interdependent on one another for survival. We see evidence of this very thing in our common life and in our politics. Commentator Claudia Heibaugh says that says this about fear. In contemporary notions of love, fear seems to be the thing that is the most divisive. Love is an act of courage. The kind of love that abides in God as expressed when people love one another is not a love that contemplates either purpose or result. It is a pure and faithful expression. Love causes us to put our shields, our fists, and our swords down because we realize that we all belong to the whole. We too belong to one another. This kind of love is that which enables us to see oneself as part of a whole rather than only as an individual. That understands that the collective good requires something of us. Sometimes giving up what we want or would rather spend our time doing for the sake of blessing and working for justice. That sees all of creation, humans and non-human life, including animals and plants and land, as mutually connected, good and worthy of celebrating, protecting, and fighting for. These are some passion flowers and milkweed and a butterfly bush in our yard. Every time we draw our attention and attend to, or every time we marvel in one another at the flowers and the bees and the butterflies and intentionally create space for them to flourish, we are acting in love. Every time that we draw our attention and attend to the needs of folks who are often unseen, ignored, or scorned, like taking these gorgeous poinsettias to our neighbors at the nursing home, we are acting in love. Every time we proclaim that God is love, and highlight the belovedness of all that God loves, we are acting in love. And every time that we step into the fight, into the public realm to fight for justice, whether that be by showing up to the Capitol and confronting the authorities to fairly fund our public schools, by protesting, by literally stepping in and interrupting when we see someone being abused or oppressed, we are acting in love. For, as Claudia Heibaugh says, there can be no question here about relative notions of relationship. In no way can there be a denial about this statement. Whether your brother or sister or sibling is related by blood, or a neighbor or an in-law, or among the recent immigrant population, you cannot love God without loving the persons who are in your line of vision. When love is understood and lived this way, healing is possible. Relationships can be restored. People from opposing sides, whatever the divide, can see one another differently. not as someone to disregard, to ignore, or to destroy, but as people who too hold divinity within them, as difficult as that may be. And maybe, just maybe, and I know this is wild, create space for common ground, for finding and building common good together. Our relationship with our environment can be healed as we seek ways to see ourselves as interconnected and entangled with the land and all of its non-human inhabitants. As impossible as these things seem, God's love and God's way of seeing the world, as well as God's work in and through us, make it possible for us to live in this way. That is why we gather here, week in and week out, to listen, to pray, to learn, and to grow in relationship with one another and with God so that we might live into this kind of love. It's a way of practicing what we preach in real time, where the stakes are not so high and we can think through these things together, rather than immediately reacting or responding to threats. I find that very helpful. Hopefully you do too. This community of exploration and trust helps us to work out what feels insurmountable. And it helps us to be connected to one another and to God, reminding us that we go about living in love with one another. In this time, in our communities, in our country, even in the world, love seems like an invaluable resource. One there's not actually a lot of. And it's maybe the only way that we can get through the coming weeks and months, if only we can commit ourselves to living into it. So friends, I wonder how this sits with you or what it brings up for you. Have you witnessed love in action in powerful ways? And how do you see us as being capable of witnessing to God's love? Marlene and I were having conversations about division and tension right before the service. And feeling at a loss. When do we say something? When do we step in? How do we step in to actually be agents of healing and not just stirring the pot? What's stirring up in your spirit?